Hello everybody, my name is Shadowlands, and in this video I'm going to go through everything that's happening to Mythic Plus affixes in Shadowlands. So we're starting off here with this beautiful world of all the affixes that currently exist in BFA. And let's get started by going through what's going to happen to each of them. So first of all, we have these three up in the top left, Teeming, Skittish, and Awakened. Awakened, of course, the seasonal affix from the current season. Obviously not going to make it into Shadowlands. Neither are Teeming or Skittish, though. All three of these affixes are dead. They are gone. So let's draw a little trash can. Trash can here. Put a little foot pedal thing to make the trash can open. Give it a little lid there. Perfect. And then we'll just take these, drag them on over. Okay, I guess that replaced the trash can. Perfect. Perfect. All right, it's in the trash can now. So those affixes are gone. What's going to happen to replace them? We have, of course, a new seasonal affix. Prideful is going to be that spot. And we have three new non-seasonal affixes. So Prideful is our new seasonal affix, and it is basically reaping, but with a single target mob instead. So every 20% enemy forces that you clear through the dungeon, you get a single target boss, mini-boss thing to fight. When you kill that mini-boss, you then get a pretty massive buff for the next minute, which is pretty awesome. It does mean that some bosses may feel a lot harder if you, say, wipe to them and then you don't have access to the Prideful buff to pull them again. But honestly, I'm not even convinced that that's going to be a real problem. And other than that, the affix looks like just going to be awesome. So I think this seasonal affix looks like it's A+, going to join Reaping and Awakened as being all-time great seasonal affixes. These other three new affixes, let's talk about what's happening to each of them. Storming is a new thing that is basically the melee version of volcanic. So when you're in combat with mobs, they're going to start spawning like King's Rest tornadoes, basically. And they originally did a lot of damage. They've been nerfed to do a lot less damage. They still knock you in a pretty annoying way. And this is still going to be a pretty punishing affix for melee relative to ranged. And it's going to be particularly difficult on mobs that don't move easily, because the best play pattern against this is just keep the mobs moving and get away from the tornado danger zone. And in some cases, that's going to be harder to do than others. But I don't know. I'm withholding too much judgment on this one. I think that it was good to nerf the damage from the original version that came out and was basically one-shotting people. Inspiring is basically Emissary of the Tides, the affix. So rather than inserting Emissaries of the Tides throughout the dungeon, it will just promote some mobs in different packs into effectively Emissaries of the Tides. They will project an aura around them that makes their friends immune to CC and immune to interrupts, but they themselves will be susceptible to CC. So the play pattern for this is going to be to crowd control them, pull the pack away from them, kill the pack away from them. Or if you're feeling like you can handle the pack without CC, or, knock the inspiring mob away for the one interrupt you need and then have it come back in, that's going to be a cool play pattern as well. This also creates some interesting creativity options where you might find ways to keep inspiring mobs CC'd and then fight them at once together if that's something that's realistic. All in all, I think a reasonable affix to add to the set. And then we have Spiteful. Spiteful is a new on-death affix. I talk a lot about on-death affixes as kind of a class that you could largely break Mythic Plus weeks into the weeks where there's an important on-death affix and the weeks where there aren't. The on-death affixes are Bolstering, Sanguine, and Bursting, and they're now being joined by Spiteful. And Spiteful is just when mobs die, they effectively create a thing from beyond that everybody can target that will go and chase one person down. And instead of exploding on them, they'll just melee them really hard. Again, this is a relatively melee unfriendly mechanic because the ghosts are going to be spawning a lot closer to you than they will to your ranged friends. But there should be enough time for you to be able to deal with these. They don't last too long, and they're susceptible to a lot of effects that you can use to keep them away from you. So another affix that, again, so Storming and Spiteful are ones that I'm not too worried about. I'm a little bit worried about them being particularly harsh to melee players in an expansion where... So if we look at, for instance, in Legion, triple ranged was a pretty strong and common metagame comp for a lot of dungeons. In BFA, the pendulum kind of swung towards triple melee for most of the expansion, bringing one or two ranged in at the very end, largely on the strength of BM Hunter and Fire Mage. In Shadowlands, I feel like there are a lot of factors that are kind of piling on to push the pendulum back away from melee and towards ranged heavy comps. And these two affixes are part of that, in addition to stuff like the AoE cap and just in general, the range specs be looking pretty good. So that's my feeling on these new affixes. Not too much to talk about them yet. I'll have more opinions as I play them when they finish getting tuned and come out on the live servers. Let's talk about what's happening to the set of other affixes that already exist. All right, so up first is Explosive. Explosive is pretty much receiving no changes. There's a slight change coming for Explosive where the orbs will spawn slightly further away than the mobs that target them. But for the most part, I'll just put a check mark there. No changes coming out for Explosive that are serious. Raging, mobs getting more damage when they're below 30% health. Also receiving no changes. Bolstering, this one is a surprise to me, is also receiving no changes. Bolstering is going to be the same friend that we've had in Dungeons since Legion, that many players find bolstering weeks to be particularly not fun weeks to play. So I'm a little surprised that they haven't done something to tone down the affix a little bit. I would have liked to see, I've had some different suggestions for how to do this. I've been thinking stuff like make it only affect damage and not health, give it a duration that refreshes when it's restacked, or maybe make smaller mobs apply, like you can nerf the size of the bolstering stack. Instead of being 20% health and damage, you can make it like 5 or 10%, and then make it so that bigger mobs apply more stacks of bolstering than just one to all their friends. And that way you don't get in the situation where like 9 little mobs ultra turbo bolster something, whereas a regular pack doesn't have that much impact from bolstering. All right, but bolstering is being unchanged, so that's the news there. Sanguine is receiving a change. The duration on Sanguine is getting changed from 60 seconds to 20 seconds, which is nice. I think that Sanguine, you could often get into these spots where you screwed Sanguine up, it full healed something, and you're like, this sucks. And then for the next minute, you have to wait for the Sanguine Puddle to go away, right? Like if you have a Sanguine Puddle under an immobile boss, for instance, that would happen. So I think it is nice that for that, and it's also nice for dungeons where, they're like tight corridors and you're moving through it, and like you drop some Sanguine in the corridor and now you're just like, okay, this sucks for the next minute, right? Like there's not really a good counterplay to this from this point. Like we screwed up, we're already being punished for it, and now we're going to continue to be punished for the next minute. So it's nice to see this little nerf here. So how do we do this? Nerf. I'll just spell it out. Nerf. But it's a small nerf. Well, yeah. Well, that's lowercase. So we'll do an uppercase nerf if they do a big nerf to anything. All right, quaking. Quaking was changed in late BFA, and it was a great change, and they are keeping that changed version. It's receiving no more changes. So quaking, making it in with the version that doesn't do any damage unless you quake somebody, but quickly scales up if you do actually quake somebody to do a lot of damage. Necrotic, similar to bolstering, is an affix that I was hoping and kind of expecting to see a tone down in how impactful it would be in like worst case situations. And that's not happening for the affix. It's like bolstering, it is remaining unchanged. Something that I also I wish that this was an affix that they looked at and maybe toned down the worst case scenario for Necrotic, where you're kind of, again, you're just in the situation where there's like CC immune mobs, and you're not a class that's particularly well suited to kiting. You don't even have Lightfoots anymore to escape on a more than once every 5-minute basis. So I think that is an affix that could use a little bit of more friendliness there, particularly because it piles on to the tanking role, which is already a role that is getting battered pretty hard this expansion. All right, up next are Tyrannical and Fortified. I like to think of Tyrannical and Fortified as kind of the sun and the moon of Mythic Plus. Fortified is the sun, where it's out, and you can go outside and play and have fun in Mythic Plus. And Tyrannical is the moon, which indicates that it's time to go to sleep and wait for the sun to come back in order to play more Mythic Plus. There are also basically no changes to these affixes. There's a slight clarifying change to how Tyrannical will work, and something that'll hopefully make it a little bit more intuitive. It's not really a nerf or a buff. I'll explain exactly how it works, but for the most part, these affixes are remaining unchanged. So Tyrannical in BFA was a little inconsistent in that it would apply to some but not all parts of boss encounters, and there would be mobs in boss encounters that would not scale with Tyrannical. Some would scale with Tyrannical, and some would scale with Fortified. And it was really hard to tell exactly which. There was a spreadsheet compiled by, let me get this person's name, somebody named Zarakis. And let me show that spreadsheet real quick, that they were working on compiling of like all the boss mechanics that were affected by tyrannical or not affected by fortified, or sorry, that were affected by fortified, and the ones that weren't affected by tyrannical or fortified. And here's a nice long list of like, and there's kind of no consistency to these as well. So the change that's happening for Shadowlands is that tyrannical is kind of being reworked to be the affix that's supposed to affect all boss mob stuff. So it'll say bosses have 40% more health, bosses and their minions inflict up to 15% increased damage. So hopefully this means that they have looked at every instance of something happening during a boss fight and made sure that it scales consistently with this sentence, so that the bosses themselves scale up in health, the boss minions scale up in damage but not health, and fortified doesn't get its hands into boss fights at all. That being said, there's a lot of different stuff to do on the back end for them, so I wouldn't be surprised if there were a few things that scaled in surprising ways in Shadowlands, because there's just so much stuff in Mythic Plus. Again, my personal hope here was that they would consider a change to the paradigm due to the fact that for like 7 of the last 8 Mythic Plus seasons, or 6 of the last 8 Mythic Plus seasons, the top like 500 runs have consisted of 500 runs from fortified weeks and 0 runs from tyrannical weeks. I was hoping that they'd be able to make a change there. There will always be people who come out and say like, oh, this only affects the top people, so why does it matter? But if it only affects the top people, then why would it matter if they change it, right? It's not gonna hurt everybody else. So seeing something like a little bit of a nerf to tyrannical, a buff to fortified, or a rethinking of those two affixes would have been something I would have liked to see. But this change, even though it's minor, still one in a good direction, I think, of at least making there be consistency in terms of when you see a mechanic on a boss fight, it scales with tyrannical and not fortified. All right, and then we come to these 3 affixes over on the right here, and I've kind of slow rolled because these 3 are ones that are receiving changes. Let's start with what's happening to Volcanic. Volcanic is no longer going to scale with your health and is instead going to deal an amount of damage that scales with Keystone level. Good change as far as I'm concerned. I think that affixes scaling with percent health versus scaling with key level. Percent health is a nice way that Blizzard has to make it easy to balance, such that it's not one-shotty and such that it is impactful. But it does mean that the difficulty doesn't increase as the key gets higher, and the difficulty actually for some affixes can be higher at lower level keys. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to bursting. So it is a more difficult balancing problem for them to solve, but I think more rewarding when they successfully do solve it, if you make it so that they scale with key level instead of with percent health. Volcanic is being changed to do that. It's also being changed to have a knock-up component. Let me show you this little GIF here. Oops, that is not how I do that. All right, here we go. There's what happens, right? The volcano comes out and you get yeeted up into the air. Not only do you take damage from the volcano, you're also going to be subjected then to some fall damage when you land. I think this is a cool way to prevent the correct move from being to stand and tank volcanoes, because unless you're a BM hunter, as we see in this clip actually, you are going to lose damage from getting hit by a volcano, right? It's going to cost you less time of casting to move than it is to get knocked up for 3 seconds, right? So this is a good change of incentive such that you're never supposed to just tank the volcanoes and have your healer heal you. One thing that I do think is to be looked out for with this is spots where this can be used intentionally to skip stuff, because getting forcibly knocked up 30 feet in the air in dungeons with any degree of verticality can absolutely be used to skip parts of the dungeon. So I already have some ideas for places that might happen. I've already heard some rumblings of this being something you can do on Volcanic weeks, but that would be a fun little side effect that I'm sure would be quickly detected and nerfed in instances where it gets used. But that's the change for Volcanic. So I'm not sure whether to call this a nerf or a buff. I think this is mostly just a kind of big change. So we'll just call it changed. Let's see, changed. I don't have enough space to write the rest of the word. All right, we'll do a dash and then changed. There we go. All right, we're on to bursting. Bursting is the next affix that we'll talk about. And it is also an affix that used to scale with percent health. And this one was particularly punishing. If you did a +10 key with bursting active versus somebody doing a +20 key, you would not only have the same amount of mobs killed, so the same amount of bursting stacks going out, you would have them going out often in a worse controlled fashion, so you'd take more damage from bursting than the people in the +20 key, and you take it over a shorter period of time generally, because 10s are usually done quicker than 20s. So the actual DPS from bursting in a plus 10 key compared to a plus 20 key was higher for healers that are, able to put out less HPS because they're in 10s and not 20s, right? So this was a really punishing affix that hit the lower end keys disproportionately hard and became kind of a non-affix in higher level keys. Not a non-affix, but it was an affix that didn't scale up in difficulty to high level keys because the damage was percent health based, and healers that were on top of their game with DPS that were on top of their game could really easily team up to mitigate all the bursting problems in a predictable way. So this affix being changed to percent scaling, not percent, but flat scaling based on key level rather than percent health based scaling is something that I think is absolutely a great move. It's also getting a magic effect instead of being just a debuff. So it can be dispelled now, which is a welcome change for healers. It means that healers can fire off one global to dispel a stack from the most vulnerable person and effectively heal them for the entire damage that bursting would do to that person. It's also a huge buff to Discipline Priest, all priests really, Shadow Priest as well. Shadow Priest, huge utility now from being able to mass dispel bursting. Warlock Imps even can take out the bursting stacks. And in general, I think that this is a cool way to give a little bit more utility to those sorts of abilities that haven't been, these kind of off healer magic dispels haven't been particularly valuable throughout most of the game's history. There have been a couple of boss fights like Rixa Flux Flame, for instance, where they've had some utility in BFA, and the Awakened Affix actually brought one with Samrak, Beckoner of Chaos as well. But I think it's cool for the Affix to have a real strength for Mass Dispel there, because Mass Dispel is extremely powerful, but there are a lot of dungeons where it didn't actually do anything in BFA, and now any week where Bursting's active, it's going to be huge value to have. So I guess this is not a check mark. This is another one where I should write the word changed. All right, we'll try again. I want to call this is like, it's a nerf for how much bursting will impact your low level keys, and it's a buff for how much bursting will impact your high level keys. And that I think is exactly what the affix needed. And it's also a buff to some specs that got some nice new utility. And I think it's also just a buff to healers that are on top of their game, being able to, to fire off a dispel. Every healer can get that, right? Not just Disc Priests and Mistweavers and Holy Priests, I guess. All right, let's talk about Grievous. Grievous is also receiving the flat damage instead of percent health damage based scaling. Again, another benefit to this also, I didn't talk about this with the other two, is that you no longer have this thing where like Power Word Fortitude actually causes you to take more damage and therefore require more healing. And so like putting on more stamina actually was kind of a drawback, right? For when these affixes were out, you would, assuming you weren't in danger of getting one shot, you'd actually rather have the lowest possible amount of stamina to make these affixes do as little damage per tick as possible. So it's nice that kind of perverse incentive is gone. Grievous is also being changed. So in addition to being scaling with key level, it is being changed to have non-periodic heals removing one stack. Although I think that they will never remove that last stack. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think from what I've seen, it'll never actually remove the Grievous entirely. But you can remove you can bring Grievous down to one stack with non-periodic heals. Periodic heals, being basically Resto Druid Hots, are not going to have that effect. You may think that Atonement is a periodic heal, but in fact, right now on beta, Atonement is removing stacks of Grievous every time it ticks, which means that one Shadow Word Pain on a target, and then Atonement on your whole group will keep Grievous to one stack instead of 4. Now, in high keys, even one stack Grievous can be pretty hurtful with the current scaling that we have on beta, so it's not entirely a non-issue for Discipline Priests, but it is, I think, a welcome buff to how Discipline Priest handles Grievous, because historically, that was a spec that got just pummeled by Grievous Week, and definitely could do with a little bit of help on that front. All in all, I think this is another good change. The fact that it particularly hurts Resto Druid, also a welcome change. Resto Druid needs all the systematic nerfs that it can get in Mythic Plus, because it is such a well-suited spec to Mythic Plus that all other things being equal, Resto Druid is just going to be so good. Every time they make these new affixes, like Inspiring and Spiteful, they just... like, both of these affixes are just naturally such good Resto Druid affixes with Entangling Roots and Ursul's Vortex and Typhoon, those sorts of effects. And so it's nice to, whenever possible, make things that help the other healers at least stay somewhat close. I still think that Resto Druid is going to be the premier healer And I think that they will still deal with Grievous very well because healing over time is just a naturally good answer to damage over time from Grievous. And pre-healing, pre-hots are a good way to make sure that nobody stays, that people get topped up really quickly. And that also answers Grievous well. So Grievous may still be a restored affix, but hopefully by a little bit of a smaller margin than it was in the past. So this one was also changed. And all three of these affixes will be doing, I think, a lot less damage if you're doing like a +5 key. Probably about the same in the +10 range if they get their balancing right, and then be more impactful as you start getting to like pushing keys much above that. All right, so that's what's happening to all the affixes in the game. Hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Stratnos. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.